Hello, everyone, and welcome to JustDAOIt, the podcast for people starting DAOs. I'm Adam Miller, and I'm your host. I'm the CEO of MyDAO, which provides legal entity solutions for DAOs. And prior to starting MyDAO, I did consulting for people starting and operating DAOs. We are recording live for the third time, and right after we record live, we will publish to our podcast feed. Hopefully, we don't have any issues with the live stream, but please leave a comment if we do so that we know and we can try to fix it. And also, don't forget to check out our new series on JustDAOIt, which is the DAO Masterclass, where my colleague Jana will interview leading lawyers and other professional advisors in the space to get their thoughts on what's going on with DAOs and give you non-legal advice. Welcome to our guest, Sky. So we've had Sky on the show before about a year ago. Sky is a leader in the DAO space. He's been involved since well before I was involved in DAOs, and really excited to catch up with him today, not only about all the cool stuff happening in the world of DAOs, but especially about DXdao, which is one of the earliest DAOs in existence. They had raised a lot of money, built several DeFi products and related products, and recently dissolved. So really interested in learning more about that and hearing why that happened and what it means, and how we can reflect on that and learn for people that are starting DAOs today. So first of all, before we dive into the show, Sky, would you just give a brief introduction to yourself and, as usual, what makes you an authority on DAOs?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's good to be back on the show. It's cool to be on a live version of it, which I don't think I've been on one of those. I've been a contributor in the DAO space for probably over 3 years now, from small community DAOs to some big DeFi DAOs, some public good focused DAOs. I've been doing that kind of full time across different communities. One of the things I focus on a lot is bringing knowledge and lessons from one community to the other, to others, sharing that, seeing how we can use lessons learned from certain communities and bring those to other communities. And so, most recently, like one of the topics we've been talking a lot about in different events, different spaces, is the life cycle of DAOs, which is really interesting and we can get into later. But most of the DAOs that have been created over the last few years, no one ever really thought about when those DAOs might end or how they would end or what would happen. And I think it was kind of just assumed they would all live on forever, but clearly that's probably not going to happen. And it's very hard for that to happen. So we're learning a lot of things about that, and it will now change how we think about DAOs and what to do going forward, I think.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's one of the really cool things happening right now in the world of DAOs. I think a lot of people are having the chance to reflect on their first one or two cycles of starting a DAO, being in DAOs, things either going well or not going well. And now we can learn from all of that. So that is really cool. As usual, we will start this episode with the JustDAOIt news report. That'll be about the first half of the show. And in the second half, we will dig deeper into the guest interview with Sky about his experience and all the things we can learn from that experience. So for the news report, I will be summarizing the following stories for the audience and for our guest. And then we will share our reactions, our hot takes, if we agree or disagree with the story, and what we think it means for people starting DAOs. So the first story of the week is from Decrypt, and the headline is, "What is a decentralized autonomous organization, DAO?" And I chose this article because I actually do think it's useful to keep returning to this question of what is a DAO, because there's still disagreement in the space. You hear varying things depending on who you ask. And so I think it's useful for us to keep asking ourselves this question and learning what we can from answering it. What this article says that I want us to agree or disagree with is, a DAO, or decentralized autonomous organization, is a business structure where control is spread out rather than hierarchical. DAOs are organized using smart contracts, with participants using governance tokens to vote on topics such as fund allocation. So I'm going to react to a couple of things here. I think it's a good start, and often I see, especially in the press, when someone defines DAO, it's not usually exactly what I would say. The first thing I'll take issue with is calling it a business structure, because a lot of DAOs are not businesses. right? They might be charities that don't think of themselves as businesses. They might be a community or a club or an association, or I don't know what I mean. Maybe I'm not even thinking of some of the types of organizations out there, but it doesn't have to be a business. So maybe let me stop there, Sky, get your reaction to any of the definition, and then
Yeah.
I'll share more.
Yeah, defining DAOs is hard. I agree with your point that it definitely doesn't have to be a business. Usually, it's, I would say, a very high level, a group of people with a common shared interest. Right. Most of these DAOs and groups tend to be organizing online, which is a new way, a new place to organize compared to, 10 years, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where generally you organized with people very local to you. So a grocery store co-op's a good example of what could be, it's a cooperative, it's a collective, it could be, you could call it a DAO, but it's very, very local. Like you live in the town with those people, and you kind of actually, you already know you know some of the people. And so that allows you to do things with that group that you wouldn't be able to do with strangers on the internet. And so the DAO tooling, the coolest thing is, it's the first time we've ever had a way for random people or handles on the internet that can work together, manage resources together, and do it without having to trust someone in the middle or trust one of the people. And so, and that has to do with often managing the capital, and that can also be with the decision making that takes place. But that is why this technology is so interesting, and you can actually only build that technology on something like a decentralized blockchain, because you can't build that technology on a centralized platform, because then you have to trust the person running the centralized platform. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to decentralization, which is why the decentralized part of DAO is probably the most interesting and important part of that. And yeah, organizing, it's a new way to coordinate that we're all learning about. It's really powerful. And then the first part about it being less hierarchical
You got it.
versus more flat, that is generally true. I would say you think of it as like, if it was a business, replace the CEO with a collective. So it doesn't mean like everyone is dead flat. It just means the CEO doesn't exist anymore. The big decisions are going to be made by the collective, which is a group, which is everyone that has this governance power. But DAOs, we are learning, have to get really good at delegation. And so once the DAO can do delegation and assign responsibilities and move capital to certain places, then you do have a bit of hierarchy. But that's okay, because the collective, which is the boss, has the power to take back any of that it granted. And so that is the key to why it's such a new, interesting way to organize.
I love that point, because, and I'm hearing more and more people in the DAO space acknowledge this fact that DAOs don't have to be completely flat, as long as the ultimate power does rest in the hands of the members in whatever distribution is intended for that project or that organization. Then to me, even if they want to elect a CEO, that's fine, right? So to me, it's the DAO takes the place of somewhere in between, like the shareholders, the board, and the CEO. And you could be as broad as the shareholders are the DAO, and you could elect a board if you want to, and then that board could elect a CEO, or you could directly, as the governance token holders, elect a CEO, or to your point, you could actually do a lot of the things the CEOs normally do as a collective. And in any of those cases, the important thing in a lot of situations is, because it's so cheap, easy, and fast and global to vote, that governance group can do a lot more easily than any governance group could in the past. So like a board, they have to use email, they have to have meetings and vote live. Shareholders would have to do like a proxy ballot or sign PDFs, which would take weeks. And so even if you wanted to give the shareholders more power, it's really hard to do, because you can only have them vote to replace the CEO every so often. But now, if a DAO did want to elect a CEO, they could also unelect that CEO as quickly as they elected him or her.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what I see as the value.
Totally. I don't like generally we're not seeing DAOs elect CEOs, but you are right that
True.
it's possible.
Yep.
But delegating certain responsibilities is definitely important.
Yeah.
What we have learned and what we don't want to continue to do is doing things in this new decentralized way is often very new and hard. And so a lot of times the easy answer to that is to use centralization. So if we just always just go, oh, we're going to solve this problem by electing a CEO for 6 months and see how that goes. And yeah, we could take it back after 6 months. That's ideally for me, that's not the way we experiment in the space. Some people should try it, but in general, we don't always want to try to just fall back to something that will work by using centralization. If we can try to work through it in some more decentralized and more fair and more collective way, that's kind of my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it depends a lot on the goals of the project, right? I mean, some projects, the goal is like create the best product as fast as we can. And if that's the case, you might be willing to make sacrifices or trade-offs in other areas like decentralization. But if the goal is, this is a group of people where we want to share power widely and share responsibility for governance, because either that's just a value that we all share or we believe that's what makes the project successful in the long run, then you're going to make many fewer compromises in that regard. So I think it's different, but you're right. I mean, like most people starting DAOs today, they're doing it because they want to do something more democratically than they could have with an old-fashioned governance structure. And so in most DAOs, right, like you said, there's no CEO, there's no board. Well, actually, a lot of DAOs, unfortunately, do have a board. And I think that's a big problem with DAOs like, Arbitrum, for example, where when they launched the first vote, and I think we talked about this in the last episode a couple weeks ago, but, they launched the first vote on the system and everyone voted no. And then the foundation board said, actually, the answer is yes. And so, unfortunately, a lot of big DAOs actually do have that type of, corporate or foundation structure. And that really does go against, I think, what the intention is and most people bring into that type of situation.
Yeah. DAOs do take different shapes and sizes, and so you probably have heard me say this before, but for true, proper, and on-chain DAOs, if your vote takes action, it's more interesting and more powerful, in my opinion. If your vote, which they can say you have a governance token or a share or a say, but if you actually do that vote and it doesn't, and it's more of a signal, and then some other smaller group or person can decide whether or not to implement that. For me, that's a problem. That's a point in this. That's a point in the system that is a more centralized failure point. And so those are less interesting to me, even though we have those, and those are okay for some people to experiment with. But at the end of the day, the real strong, unstoppable systems will truly be without basically any centralized points of failure along the entire process.
Yep, love it. All right, let's turn to the next article of the week. This one is from jdsupra.com, which is a legal journal. And the headline is Managing DAO-Related Risks. So this is an article by several individuals, and they've tried to dig in from a legal perspective into what a lot of the risks are that DAOs and their members face. So I just want to read from an outline in the article what these authors see as the top risks, and let's see if we can identify a missing risk or agree or disagree with any of these. So first of all is the regulatory risk. So whatever the actual work is of the DAO, right, what are the regulations that might apply to that situation? So like in the UkiDAO case, which a lot of people have heard of, and we'll talk a little bit more about, they were providing what was later deemed as clearly financial services. And so if you're a DAO that provides financial services, you better think about regulations related to financial services. Interpersonal risk, right? Things going wrong with the social structure or disagreement or drama within the DAO. Smart contract risk. So could there be a bug in the smart contract or an unintended consequence in the smart contract or a way of manipulating the smart contract? There is progressive decentralization risk. So interesting note that a lot of DAOs start out as as fairly centralized with the plan to be to decentralize over time. But what if they don't, or what if they don't do it well? There's intermediary risk. So to the point you were just talking about, Sky, that DAOs can sometimes rely on intermediaries such as a multi-sig that actually controls the money, that's supposed to do what the DAO says they should do, but won't necessarily do that. Finally, governance risk. So this refers to, in this article, the risk of governance attacks or other situations where a small group of people can get a hold of a large portion of the governance rights, even though it wasn't the intention, and then they can either drain the treasury or just move things in whatever direction they want to. So this is a really good starting point list of risks facing DAOs. Is there anything, Sky, that you would react to or add or differ with?
Well, yeah, those are all risks. We know that there will be many risks in this when we're like on the edge of new technologies and things. It is great to identify and think more about these risks. I don't know if in this article they're providing any solutions. Like the people that I hang out with in the space, we probably are aware of these risks. We have identified them. And what we try to do every day is we try to come up with the solutions to these risks, because identifying risks is easy. It's the figuring out how to prevent these risks. And so whether it's like in the DeFi space and there's this protocol DAO, or I'm using a protocol, there's always smart contract risk. The more complex it is, probably the more risky it is. But there's, the longer these things are around with not having, contract risks and things, we start to become more comfortable that they're like holding up to what we think the code's going to do. And so with each one of those, that's one example. That's smart contract risk versus some new project that just gets deployed tomorrow, and then we all think we're going to go into that system. That's probably a lot more risky. And so that's an example of taking an approach to one of the risks in the space. With the decentralization or progressive decentralization risk, I agree that all these projects that start very centralized, which tend to be small teams with very talented people that then deploy something and they want to become a decentralized DAO, the problems that they have is they often have trouble distributing the governance power. Basically, what you want to do is you want to get your governance power in the hands of who would be the best governors of this system. But that's really, really hard to do. And there's smart people doing certain airdrops and token drops and pinpointing exactly who should get these tokens and trying to get those governance tokens in the hands of the right people. And then what you'll only really know if you do that, you get the right governors, you get the power in those people's hands, and then you start to have them govern the system, and you will see how that works. But it's very hard to know from day one. And the really small teams that launch, and a lot of the governance power ends up in the hands of the creators or the hands of the early investors and things. That's naturally going to happen, but they want it to become more decentralized. But how they distribute that power and those tokens, it takes a lot of thought, takes time probably. And some end up like not doing it that well, and they want to be more decentralized and they don't, and they can't. And so that then often like it's not really that well of a decentralized distributed DAO. And so then you're back to like the early days of, a few people control a lot of it, and then it's less interesting as a decentralized organization.
Yeah, interesting. It's kind of like if DAO is planning on doing an airdrop, or you think they might, then a lot of people will, I don't know what the word is, but like do an airdrop attack in the sense that like farm, thank you, where they're pretending to be really engaged in whatever ways they think will lead to them being granted a lot of tokens. And then you may end up with lots of those farmers as your governance holders instead of the people who are really engaged. That's a great one. All right, so let's turn to the next story of the week. This one, we'll actually dig a little more into that ex-DAO case, because we haven't talked about that yet on the show since the final ruling was handed out. So this article is from CoinDesk, and the headline is, CFTC wins lawsuit against ex-DAO. The regulator's victory serves as proof decentralized entities can face legal consequences for their dealings, contrary to popular belief. All right. So first of all, if really popular belief is still that you cannot be held legally accountable for your actions just because you're doing it through a DAO, then people are wrong. I think that's kind of a given to me. Now, I do often talk about, and Sky, you've heard me talk about kind of evolutionary versus revolutionary DAOs, where most of the DAOs that are out there, I think people are not trying to hide from the world; they're trying to just fit into the regulatory environment. And I mean, that's what we help people with at my DAO, and so maybe that's just mostly what I see. You do also have the more revolutionary DAOs, as I like to call them, which are DAOs that really do want to just like hide from the legal system and say, look, we're going to be totally anonymous. We're going to be censorship resistant, unstoppable, to your point, even to the point that the government can't stop us. And so, in that case, the use of tools and technology and the things that blockchain makes possible, perhaps the goal is to avoid legal consequences. But again, I think in most cases, the way DAOs should be thinking about this is that, like, of course, like any group of people in this world that we live in today that engages in a common enterprise or that comes together to work on something together, whatever you want to call it, pretty much every government in the world is going to look at what you do, and if they think it's illegal or if there's been some kind of fraud or whatever the situation is, you're getting sued. Of course, they're going to try to hold you accountable. And I think one of the key learnings from this Uki-DAO case is that the court in California, there were two things that kind of went wrong for the DAO. So first of all, the court in California in the United States said, we do have jurisdiction over you. And the reason for that is that you don't have a legal entity anywhere in the world. And so we can kind of pick and choose what jurisdiction we might hold you accountable in. And you have some members in California. And so so for those reasons, we're gonna, give our court jurisdiction over you. So if that DAO had a legal entity, obviously I love the Marshall Islands because that's where we do our legal entity work, then the court in California would say, oh, like, we don't have jurisdiction here, like, go sue them in the Marshall Islands or wherever, makes more sense for whatever reason. The second thing here is because they don't have a legal entity, the individuals are being held directly accountable for the DAO's activity. And this is another thing that, we've been saying for a while. And I think a lot of any lawyer you talk to in the space will have been saying this for the last several years, that, without any kind of like corporate umbrella or legal protection, of course, the members of the DAO will potentially be held liable as individuals for the DAO's activity. And so it's another good reason to create a legal entity. The other side of this story, though, is, some of the activity, I think, was criminal anyways, or broke securities laws in a way that even if you did have a legal entity, they would still go after the founders of this DAO and hold them liable for example, offering unregistered securities and futures and options. And so that, that again goes to the regulatory risk of what, business your DAO is in and what service it's providing. So anything there to react to, Sky, or add?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on the case, but my understanding is one of their, defense arguments where they were trying to use decentralization as like a defense. As we spoke about earlier, I actually don't think Uki-DAO in how it was operating or set up was actually a proper on-chain decentralized DAO in any way. I think there were like a couple different multi-sigs on a couple different chains. One multi-sig might not have even been a wallet. It might have been like one of one or just a normal wallet. I think that's where the money got taken from. The multi-sig that had actually a 3 of 5 or a 2 of 3 or something, which is also a very small set of people, I believe that was actually safe and there was nothing exploited from there. So in my mind, that's not a good case on DAOs, because I don't even consider that like anywhere close to a proper decentralized DAO. If we took some of the extremes, the example I often use the most is like Uniswap protocol DAO, which actually the token holders own, there's 360,000 wallets that own the actual protocol. They could turn on a fee. They have the right to do some settings. That's actually like a really decentralized owned DeFi protocol. I would call that a protocol DAO. Some people would consider Ethereum a DAO, just with off-chain voting, but like I can vote with my Ether tokens, and meaning like by the actions I take, right? And so those two are extreme examples of very, very decentralized. Some would even say so decentralized that they couldn't have legal entities. We couldn't put everyone that has Ether into a legal entity. That's very extreme thinking, or these are extreme examples, but that's like when you're using true decentralization, I think the risks and how you can assign liability and things is slightly different. Like the question are those 360,000 unit token holder wallets all liable or responsible for all of the money that is flowing through a pretty permissionless DeFi protocol called Uniswap protocol, and that's running on Ethereum? And I don't know the answer to that, but I would say not really. And if that would be a very interesting court case. And I think the SEC has been investigating Uniswap for a couple of years. If that went to court, I would be more interested in what the court says about that case than the DAO case, because I don't even consider that really a proper DAO. So
yeah, that's such a great point. And definitely going to be interesting to see when these larger DAOs do end up in some kind of legal battle. But I think you're right. I mean, if I just think about from a rational perspective, if you're really just like a user of the protocol, like effectively you have like 0.001 governance rights, and you just have those because like you use the protocol, it just kind of makes sense. Or maybe you were rewarded as a user with some governance rights. Should you really be held liable for like what that DAO is doing day to day, versus maybe there's a team of like 50 people who are the developers and the engineers and the designers who actually work on the protocol day to day? And I mean, again, even in a traditional corporate setting, the employees and who work on a project are not held liable, right? Again, because there's like a legal entity, and of course, like you're not going to hold like the employee of the company liable for its activity. It's like we all kind of know that naturally, but I do wonder where, if anywhere, liability would fall in that type of like truly decentralized situation.
Yeah, even in the Uniswap case, though, the people that work at Uniswap Labs, the company in New York, like they have unit token, just like the other people have unit token, but they're not working on the protocols. It's like on Ethereum. They're working on like some code on GitHub that's going to potentially be the next version of Uniswap, which is now they're considering it a public good. It's open for anyone to contribute to. So it's not even them working on it anymore, which is like a whole nother step to like a decentralized protocol. The world is going to build it instead of the small team in New York. And then it's going to go onto Ethereum, and 400,000 people having the token are going to own it and control it. I don't know how that's never happened before, which is why there are no court cases or governments that know how to look at that. That's why it's all very difficult and so new. But I agree with you that like, it's okay. Like I like the idea of these on-chain protocols like that being like on-chain DAOs. I'm okay with Uniswap DAO being an on-chain protocol without a legal entity, but anyone that's contributing to it, like Uniswap Labs or a small dev team or a marketing team or even a single person, I agree that these people should probably have legal entities. It doesn't hurt to have legal entity, and you contribute to this on-chain collective via a legal entity.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And I know there's some legal entities involved, right? To your point, the on-chain labs, there could be a foundation involved. I'm not sure, that maybe holds like the intellectual property of the name and the logo. So yeah, great point. All right, turning to the next story. Actually, this is going to be a tweet from Optimism. And Optimism tweet thread is the following, and I'll read several of the tweets. Over the next 10 weeks, we are doing a deep dive into the key findings and recommendations from Lavender's research into the history of DAOs and their policies, programs, and processes. The first takeaway we want to focus on is related to voting. Let's take a look. DAOs should match their decision-making models to decision type. Early DAOs mirrored direct democracies with token holders voting on all decisions, but this isn't always the most efficient or optimal method. Recognizing this, many DAOs transitioned to representative democracy using elected councils. While this streamlines operations, it can concentrate power. Instead, the goal should be to deploy multiple decision-making models, each tailored to the decision type. The trick is knowing when to use which model. Some decisions need more decentralization, while others can tolerate less. Vitalik Buterin's concave versus convex decision-making model is useful here. Vitalik Buterin writes that when decisions are convex, decentralizing the process of making that decision can easily lead to confusion and low-quality compromises. When decisions are concave, relying on the wisdom of the crowd can give better answers. So I just want to explain this last thing because I'm sure that's very confusing to a lot of people listening, especially if you haven't read Vitalik's article, which is a good, very technical article. What he's saying is, imagine that we put all the decisions that a DAO might have to make into two categories, right? Which is an oversimplification. But on one hand, you have decisions where a compromise is going to be the best outcome. Like you want to kind of find the middle ground, like what's going to please like group A and group B both to like a solid extent, and you end up somewhere in the middle, and then that's the best outcome, right? And he calls that, I think that one is concave. And you can imagine like a chart that is like high in the middle where like satisfaction is going to be highest overall when you're somewhere in the middle. Now imagine a convex decision where the most utility comes from picking one of the two outcomes, but not compromising. So imagine like a situation where the organization knows it can afford to build one product, and you're trying to choose between two products that you could build. And if you end up like with a mesh somewhere in the middle where it's like half of product one and half of product two, then like that's just, it's not going to make any sense. It's not going to work. And so in that type of situation, you need to pick A or B, right? And so what Vitalik says is, look, if you're trying to choose A or B, but not be anywhere in the middle, have a vote. But if you need instead to find that compromise, that consensus, that's a little bit of A, a little bit of B, you know, kind of putting these things together, then don't use a vote, then try to have, you know, use a different type of decision making, like even just having discussions and trying to come to, you know, consensus around what a good compromise is. So I think that not every decision is going to fall easily into one of those two categories, but I think the point is, if you analyze each decision that has to be made, you can then decide what type of decision-making framework to use. I guess maybe the biggest challenge that comes to mind for me when I think about that is who's deciding, right? Because if you have a democratic, decentralized governance structure, I mean, I guess first you could go to the group and say, well, let's vote on which decision-making structure to use, and then let's make the decision. Sounds a little bit complicated, but either way, I think definitely one of the things I hear a lot about today in the world of DAOs is like we've been doing voting for a while now, and people are seeing like the good and bad of voting and trying to figure out, are there alternative ways of making decisions in DAOs where we don't always have to just vote for A or B and just pick one of the two.
Yeah, I would put all of this. I mean, so this is getting very detailed. This can get very complex. I think about things very high level. I would put all of that into DAOs need to get better at delegation. And so if the collective doesn't have to make all these decisions and they start doing macro grants, micro grants, moonshot bets, development of their next protocol, and community like investment ideas, you can as long as the overall collective decides as a vote that those 5 things are important, then they can actually come up with 5 different ways to run each of those initiatives. Some can be just 2 people giving out micro grants to people in a certain region, right? Some can be you know, a much wider group of people from outside communities that as a collective, they have awesome information because they're experts in their field and they can direct one of the initiatives. And so I like the idea of coming up with the best way to execute and initiate and decide on the different initiatives. And they can all be different. And we should actually experiment with more than one of them. Like even for micro grants, we could do micro grants where half the micro grants are given out by the 2 of us because we're experts in something. And then the rest of the micro grants are given out by a token wide vote that's very easy to do on Snapshot. And we can see which of those methods leads to better micro grants. And we have to do so once we start doing delegation in DAOs, the second most important thing, which is the other main thing that I've discovered DAOs need to get better at, is evaluation. So if DAOs get really good at delegation of power and money and decision making, and then they get really good at evaluation of those things that they just did, then the DAO can take the next epoch or the next period, and they can learn from what they did, and they can improve on it, and they can have more success in the next round. So those are the two biggest things.
So relatedly, the next tweet I want to highlight is from Brantley.eth or at Brantley Milligan. And this is actually a long post, which I guess you can do on Twitter now. And the headline is "A Call for DAO Minimalism in Protocol Governance. ex-DAO is a Case Study." So what Brantley argues in this post is basically don't do governance unless you have to. Like, it's hard. If things can operate without needing official governance, just do it without DAO governance. And when you do need governance, he says, cut 95% of what the DAO is doing and only ping the delegates once a year for the annual budget and an occasional or rare update in registration parameters. So he's saying, like, just use a DAO for the biggest decision, do an annual budget, and then let the team run with it. So I think it's one good example of kind of maybe taking it a little bit to an extreme, but just leaving certain types of decisions to the entire community. And then, to your point, right, delegate and let people run with whatever that decision was. Personally, one of the most exciting things to me is more of like a liquid representative democracy, or like a liquid delegation where you can the DAO can vote someone into power in some kind of like capacity, right? Like you're delegating them to do like a certain thing, but then you can pull that back at any time, right? At any moment you can take your tokens back and put them for a different person, or maybe you provide a budget that's going to be paid out monthly, and then at any point during that year, if the entire DAO decides, this isn't going well, let's pull back the budget. Right. And so now you are delegating, but you're also retaining the right to kind of like undelegate or redelegate at any time. I think that's going to be a really powerful model.
Yeah, that's a good summary and a good, I like the idea of that he's proposing. I think some people are trying that a little here and there. And what you just described is kind of a good summary of some of the things we were talking about earlier. But yeah, getting really good at not that much governance, delegation, evaluation, and then re-governance. And if you can minimalize that, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yep. All right. The last news story of the day is also another tweet. And this tweet is from Zora, which is at our Zora. And the tweet is announcing the Zora network. This was just a day or two ago. Zora announced that they are launching a layer 2 on Ethereum based on the Optimism framework and technology. And why I'm really excited about this, usually people hear about Zora because of their NFTs and their NFT platform that people use to launch their NFT projects. So get a lot of media, a lot of big projects. The reason I like Zora is they're also really involved in DAOs. So they built something called Nouns DAO and a protocol called Nouns Builder that allows anyone to create a DAO that works like the Nouns DAO. And for anyone who doesn't know, I'll just give a brief summary of how Nouns works because it's really interesting. So Nouns is a model, and forget about the word nouns. They could have picked anything. But basically, it's a DAO where once a day, there's an auction. And the winner of that day's auction gets an NFT that represents one vote in the DAO. An NFT also can look really cool. It's kind of a separate question, but what this has led to is DAOs where, as long as you have, let's say, a large group of people, thousands or tens of thousands or more people who would love to be a part of the DAO, they all have to bid every day and find kind of the market price for being the next person to enter the DAO. So in the case of the original Nouns, they've actually raised millions, I think tens of millions of dollars, because every day these auctions are going for like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. So of course that's going to be the exception, not the rule. But there are a lot of other DAOs. I think every day there are DAOs launching on the Nouns Builder, which you can find at nouns.builder, to use that similar model. And you can do once a day, you could do once an hour, you can set whatever minimum price you want. So I'm part of a couple Nouns DAOs where the daily auction ends up being like $100 to $200. And so it's much more affordable. You're either supporting a protocol or it's a community. It could be for fun, could be for business, could be for charity. And yet you're still raising money over time. So, I think I was member 126 in Purple DAO, which is a DAO that supports the Farcaster ecosystem. That's a Web3 social protocol. And purple, the auction goes for $100 or $200 a day, and now we have like $100,000 in the treasury because it's been 250 days. Anyways, Zora is the one.
Yeah.
They're the developers. That's the development company that built this platform. And the first layer 2 they are taking Nouns Builder to is their own layer 2 Zora. So I'm really excited for there to be another blockchain that may end up, it's a layer 2 that may end up being very DAO oriented or DAO focused. Kind of like Gnosis chain is one that, for a while people have considered to be a very DAO friendly chain. So that's what's exciting to me about this story. Anything to add, Sky?
Totally. So a couple things. I like that you brought up Nouns because I'm a big fan of Nouns. So the original Nouns DAO and then a hand of Nouns derivatives were like actually just forks of Nouns. And then Zora, which is an amazing organization in the space, they have like the hyperstructure paper. They are doing lots of creative stuff. They decided on their own to build what you mentioned is nouns.build, which is this tool that makes it very easy for other people to do that, because otherwise you kind of have to like fork all the code and do it. This you can do like a no code, like click a bunch of settings and click the button and get your own nouns fork. It fits within their structure. I'm a member of Public Nouns, which is another Nouns DAO like DAO, and we are a lot like Nouns DAO. Similar mechanism, but we have all public goods oriented people that are excited and are involved in the DAO. And so we auction off public nouns, twice a day. And we use all of the money in the treasury as a group to do experiments in the public goods space. So that's a really cool way to a lot of people are taking Nouns idea mechanism and then applying a very specific goal or mission or niche to that. And it's a great way to do it. There are some risks with Nouns DAOs, which we can get into if we want to, the details. But in general, Zora and Zora with Nouns build, and we're realizing that a lot of these things, we really need to be thinking about building these things on L2s. Like even whether it's the future of Uniswap or the future of DAOs or the future of anything, we know that like gas is not that high right now, but like it's going to go back up. It's going to go up. It's going to get really expensive. We actually need to keep building with layer 2 first in mind, so that people can have a good experience when they're using these things and they're not spending, $50 on gas every time. And so the fact that they're already thinking about Nouns build on L2 and all of these projects, which they have like a community post with a bunch of cool projects, NFT related and creatives and artists and things, and thinking about how they can all fit into the L2 the L2 ecosystem they're creating. And there's a lot of L2s already, but like we may see in the next year 100 more L2s come out. And this is where I get a little overwhelmed. It's a little hard for me to understand how, when we have 125 L2s, how we're going to interact with those and how they're going to talk with each other. And so that's going to happen. We're going to have to solve that, but it's going to happen. And these theme-based L2s are coming. There's gaming ones, there's DeFi ones, there's, app-specific ones, there's creative ones, there's public good ones. And so that's something that I'm looking forward to seeing how it's going to play out. But it's going to get a little tricky. We're going to be overwhelmed with a bunch of L2s before we figure out how it all works.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I definitely say, I think it's a good piece of alpha. Like L2s are going to be huge this year, or, in the next 12 months, say, because, especially when the next bull market comes, assuming it comes, but gas fees are high. Like if there's a compelling alternative L2 that everyone uses, even just for accepting payments, like our company, when we get paid for a legal entity for a DAO, and they send the money on Ethereum, that costs them $10 or more if gas is high, right? And then we send the money to Circle so that we can take it out into our bank account in a lot of cases. And the total fees are way less than credit card fees, by the way. So like still awesome, even if we had to do it on Ethereum. But I'd rather save the $10 every time I got to send money to Circle. So if we could do it on Arbitrum, which I think Circle just launched, native support for Arbitrum, that's going to be amazing. But to your point, what happens when there's 150 chains to choose from? It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah.
So, all right, that does it for the JustDAOIt news report. Now we're going to turn to our featured guest interview with Sky. We're going to dig into some really interesting DAO-related topics. Before we get too deep, let's just take one step back and introduce you in a little bit more detail to the audience. So would you just tell us again, I know you probably did this a year ago for anyone who did listen, but how did you get into Web3 and DAOs in the first place? And what are you working on now?
Yeah. Originally I come from a commodities finance background. So for me, the first interest in crypto was like digital commodities, understanding that as Bitcoin as that. But then in really, 2017, I was getting into the Ethereum space and everything crazy was happening. And I started working in the space full time in 2018. Was working for a blockchain, which actually was a DAO, one of the first DAOs, which was actually POA network, which then launched ex-DAO chain, which then became Gnosis chain. So have experience in that kind of in that vertical. But then in the bear market, of 2018, 2019. Really found DAOs as interesting communities, started originally contributing to the MetaCartel grants DAO ecosystem, saw that all of the projects and things the things that the people in that space were doing, and then kind of latched onto DAOs. And then the last basically, few years, I've contributed to a whole bunch of DAOs, but one of the DAOs that I was working with is DXdao in the DeFi space, which was a very decentralized DAO from the start. It was originally started and was birthed by Gnosis and DAO Stack to manage the Dutch exchange. It then kind of grew a life of its own. It raised money, and it actually started, its mission was to build DeFi products in the space and also governance tools, and really focus on the actual, it's always been a very at the far end of the spectrum of a decentralized DAO. And so it always wanted to take the path of the decentralized path. And so any of the products and tools and things that didn't exist, that to actually function as a proper centralized DAO, it started investing in or building itself. And so that was the goal. And it was nice to see that happening in the space when a lot of things were coming out as centralized teams that wanted to become DAOs. We were seeing if DXdao plus a handful of other DAOs were trying to build products and things as DAOs. But there's a lot of lessons learned over that time, and it actually recently dissolved. And so, in the last probably 6-9 months, there's a lot of stories about DAOs either kind of use the word dying, but either lack of attention or stagnation or running out of money and not having runway, or having other problems, not getting the users or the revenue that it needs to have more sustainability. And so we've actually seen quite a few DAOs kind of pass on over the last number of months. And there's lessons we can learn from that. It's no one's ever really thought about before now, like how a DAO can die or how it can close down, or what happens to any of the resources left and the people. And so so we've been in the last few months at lots of events, from Soulbound to DAO Tokyo to DAO Palace to other events. One of the big topics is the kind of the life cycle of DAOs and the end of life planning for DAOs, and how you should think about from the start. Like if you're going to start a DAO today, you should definitely think about how it's going to end or what the plan for it is in the future. And you can make DAOs that if your plan is for it to live on forever, that's good to know too. But you should at least be thinking about that from the start now. And it becomes really interesting. You can start to think about all these different thought experiments about how you could think about the end of a DAO, whether you program it in, whether it's time-based or capital-based or mission-based or accomplishment-based, or some third party can decide. And so forcing that decision point becomes really interesting. And the cool thing is the people, because the autonomous in DAOs for me is the DAO is not necessarily autonomous, but the people that are in a DAO are autonomous. They can make their own decisions. They can choose to contribute to that DAO or not contribute, or another DAO. And so even though these DAOs and these mechanisms can pass and move on, the people that are contributing, the people that make up these DAOs still live on, and their ideas live on. And so they can always form new DAOs, right? With new ideas or a new path, and get new capital and new people, and they can go different ways. And so it's kind of, you think of it as a forest, right? You can have a tree, but if the tree dies, it goes into the soil and new things sprout up. Like the DAO the DAO ecosystem and these projects can be like a continuous cycle of ideas and things. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see this all happening now. And the bear market, I think accelerates it, but we're learning a lot. And I think all of that knowledge will be useful for going forward in the DAO space.
Yeah, no kidding. And I'm really excited to dig into DXDAO in particular in more detail in this interview. I think it's interesting that the language that you use is like really anthropomorphizing the DAO in the sense of saying like it's dying, it's passing on. I think most businesses probably have an exit strategy. Is that basically what we're talking about here, or is it different for DAOs for some reason?
Well, when you say exit, so okay, for startups, exit strategy is usually like the optimistic exit strategy. Like I either become an IPO, I become a public company, or I get acquired or something, right? Most startups fail, right? But in the my understanding is in the documents of all like legal entity startups and things, there's very clear language in these documents about if this thing is going to fail or end or die, like what has to happen from the board members to the assets of the company to the people of the company, right? It like that over many, many years has been well thought out and is often in the document when you create the company. The what happens when the company ends is in it, right? When we created DAOs the last 4 years, that none of that was in any documents, right? There's no this is what will happen if the DAO needs to end, or if it needs to change its mission, or if it runs out of money. There is nothing written about that. So we're having to do it live, basically. There's optimistic endings as well, but we haven't had many things like acquisitions, right? But some people, when they launch the token, a project launches a token, it becomes a DAO, it like exits to the community or exits to the public. Some people kind of think of that as an IPO, but what that just means is they're expanding their stakeholders and their governors, but the project isn't dying. The project is living on. So that would be, I guess, an optimistic expansion of a community or a DAO.
Yeah, interesting. Now that I think about it, I mean, I think one thing you're referring to is, so there's a lot of situations where if the DAO doesn't find a way to die gracefully, there's some probably uglier ways that it might die. So for example, a lot of DAOs, if you have a liquid token that is tradable, that controls the DAO, there's always this risk of a 51% governance attack, where if the DAO can do anything it wants to with a 51% vote, and what's stopping 51% of the people from saying, you know what, we're just going to vote to give 100% of the DAO's assets to ourselves and screw over the other 49% of people. And I think when things are not going well, there's probably even more incentive to do that, because people are, maybe there's drama, it's stressful, they're not as optimistic about the future of the DAO. And so, if there's a scenario where someone might perform that type of governance attack, perhaps if there was an easier way for them to exit, or a way, a planned way of shutting down the DAO more gracefully, maybe they would opt for that instead of doing the 51% attack. I mean, is that something that you're seeing as these DAOs are reaching end of life, that it's like either we need to find a way to die gracefully, or else it's going to happen in this less graceful way?
Yeah. A couple of things on that. So in that attack scenario, one of the important things is the governance token a true governance token that has actually control and say of like that treasury, for example, right? Because if it's just a signal governance token and there's a multi-sig of the founders or a handful that actually have the actual say of the treasury, you can't attack it with the fake governance token or the signal governance token. So you can't attack. And most DAOs in the space, there is a multi-sig like that. Not all of them, but many there are. And so that affects that attack vector. Many DAOs die by stagnation or lack of attention. And when you stop paying attention, or mainly there are certain DAO frameworks where if you are not paying attention, it can more easily be attacked. And so that's just like an attacker can treasure if no one's paying attention. And there's presentations. Isaac Patka has done presentations at Dev about this, like DAOs that got attacked because no one was paying attention to them. And then your second, what was your second point? I'm blanking on it now.
Well, just thinking about, if there's a more graceful way, if we can provide a more graceful option for exiting so that people would do that instead of this type of like 51% attack.
It was on we've divided these things into a couple things. So in these communities, in these organizations, if you have a right to exit, most of us believe in Web3, in this open world, like people should have a right to exit. No one should be held into something that they don't want to be. So in Moloch DAO frameworks, there's often a thing called rage quit. Rage quit means you can leave at any time. That if you don't like something that's going on, you can leave at any time with your then share of what's left in the DAO, right? And no one can stop you from doing that. That's really powerful. And so it basically is a check on people doing bad things in the DAO, because if someone tries to do something bad, everyone can just rage quit their funds, and then that thing can't happen. Generally in liquid token governance, which is a whole nother, so those Moloch DAO is often non-transferable governance power using like a share, and DXdao used rep. But in liquid token systems where capital matters, like you're saying, if there's liquidity on the token and you don't like what's going on. So for example, Uniswap protocol DAO, if I have a bunch of Unitoken and I don't like what's going on with their DAO, they're wasting money, they're not making progress, I can just sell my tokens on the open market because it's pretty liquid. And so that is me exiting the community, right? Now the question is, if I actually wanted to exit, but like let's say the market cap of the token was 10 million and there was $100 million of ETH in the treasury, if in that case, if I want to exit, but I actually want my share of the treasury, then it comes down to, is the governance token a true governance token? Or can I negotiate the people that do control the treasury to give me my share of that treasury? And so they're all, it's really specific to the DAO framework, what type of governance they're doing, and then kind of valuations of what's going on in the system. But at the end of the day, for any DAO, especially like a DAO that's building products in the space, and DXdao is an example of this, it had plans to build a whole bunch of really interesting products, but it unfortunately was building them. It delivered, a product like Swapper, but Swapper doesn't even have governance. The other products were coming along. Some were launched like Omen, and then were kind of failed. We're not being used anymore. But at the end of the day, you can only go on for so long without delivering like a bunch of, or a single or more than one complete product that then gets users and hopefully starts to earn revenue for that system. And that's how you reach like financial sustainability, is when your revenues and your protocol revenues are more than your costs. And there's actually, in the DeFi space, there's only a handful of projects that are like net, like revenue positive or net profitable. And part of the reason is many protocols, the amount of tokens they give out through emissions and farming actually is way more than the protocol revenues. So like a great example of a really successful project in the DeFi space that's been an OG long time around for a long time is probably Maker. Maker as a system is like net profitable. Uniswap protocol would be net profitable if it actually turned on a protocol fee. It doesn't really give out emissions, and it like has massive users and massive volume, and if it turned on a fee, it would be making money. But even I think examples like Curve, which is a massive protocol used by many people, I believe the last time we looked, like the emissions are bigger than the protocol revenue that comes into the system. And so this is all like product market fit or sustainability. I think the user base in general compared to traditional world is still small, and I think we think it's all going to grow a lot. And so these things could become profitable because they're building their key pieces to a future decentralized financial system. But at this point, we're still working through these things, and at some point, especially in a bear market, stakeholders will call out and check that ability and what's been delivered by those DAOs, and that's partly why some DAOs have recently been forced to close or dissolve or shut down.
So is that what happened with DXdao? It just unfortunately wasn't able to build successful products, and so people decided, hey, if this isn't working, we should just shut it down and find a different way. And I mean, how did that happen? Like, what went wrong over time, or nothing went wrong and it's just natural? I mean, how would you assess the situation?
Yeah, these products are very hard to build. DeFi products, governance products. We were working through it. It wasn't moving as fast. The bear market, it's hard to get users. It's the DeFi space is very competitive. We had interesting things. We had unique things like Omen, which is the prediction market platform. Even though Vitalik and people talk about prediction markets a lot, I'm like, so far, not many people seem to be big users of prediction market platforms. So yeah, I guess without products that are getting users or seeing a path to lots of users and lots of revenue, if you're just kind of moving along, there should be a decision point, right? And that decision point was probably forced by a few different stakeholders. But it's the cool thing about letting a DAO die or dissolve is that people can take that capital and the human resources that are contributing to that DAO, and they can spin up in fresh sprouts from like the ground and come up with new ideas and new projects and stuff. And so three projects that are that spun out during the dissolution of the DAO, which is Swapper and AMM, Carrot, like an incentive token platform, and then Davi, which is a governance framework, tooling framework. Those three got some runway from the DAO, and there's a small team of devs that are working on those products still. Those can, they are their own projects. They can become their own DAOs. So they have a chance. It's not like the whole thing just died, but spinning them out, letting them see if they can fly is kind of what was done in the proposal. And then giving majority of the capital, which basically belonged to the DXD token holders, giving that back to the DXD token holders, and then a bit of capital went to the rep holders who had the governance power in DXDAO. But it was, I guess it's a rather orderly dissolution. There's a handful of things that were like unanswered and still outstanding, but the DAO does not really have a way to do any governance currently. It does not have a system that it can govern with. So those unanswered questions actually can't really be answered as a DAO. They could be answered or suggestions by some individuals and things, but the DAO cannot currently do any governance, which is kind of weird. Yeah.
So how did that happen? Is that because all of the, why can't the DAO do governance? Did they somehow automatically swap out people's tokens for assets, or?
Once the signal proposal passed to dissolve the DAO, and that actually passed, and it had some of the details of what that would mean, there was basically a multi-sig, which we could, let's say, a god multi-sig that was everyone that voted for the proposal to dissolve the DAO was put on that multi-sig, and that multi-sig basically took control of the entire DAO. So rep voting, which is the governance power of the normal framework, doesn't really matter anymore because there's a multi-sig that that basically controls the entire DAO. And so it can mint unlimited rep, it can burn anyone's rep, it can do whatever it wants. So there's effectively not a DAO, a working DAO framework. And one of the responsibilities of that closure multisig is to let people who have DXD redeem it for their share of the treasury. So what you can do if you have DXD token currently, it's eventually not going to be, it's not going to be valuable. So if you have it, you should go to either CowSwap or Uniswap, and there's basically like a standing wall order where you can sell at the closure price. You can sell your DXD for ETH and take your share of the ETH away as a DXD holder.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I do have some DXD and I haven't been paying close attention. So if anyone in the audience,
you have a year. You have a year from the
that's good.
I guess from that proposal to do it. But yeah, get the word out. We don't want people holding a token that will eventually be worthless. So
wow, interesting. Okay, so what have you learned from this experience that you will apply to future DAOs or other DAOs that you're involved in? And not just like if things go wrong, but like from the beginning, how do you actually prepare for this type of situation more effectively?
Yeah. It's a cool thought experiment is like the original, the DAO, right? If the original the DAO didn't, and that was kind of like a big venture DAO with 15% of the ETH from the ecosystem in the DAO. Imagine that thing still existed and was owned so many of the protocols on Ethereum and things. It's hard to imagine how that governance would be happening today. It would be so big. And so like generalized DAOs without like very clear missions are probably less, it's harder for them to have success than maybe more narrow, smaller focused DAOs that have like a very clear mission. And so this is thinking about the objective of the DAO. Like a lot of friends and me will like spin up a DAO to do like a certain thing for like 2 weeks, and we could do that as a DAO. We could not do that as a DAO, but like you have like a very specific project or mission based DAO. And so it's okay to have DAOs that like only do a certain thing and then you don't use it anymore. Thinking about the end of the DAO. So end of DAO planning, like, end of life planning for people. They start talking about that before it becomes necessary. So end of DAO planning, you shouldn't do like as you're approaching the end of DAO. You should actually do end of DAO planning when you create the DAO. You can have a decision point. An example would be, we're going to create a DAO in 1 year from now. There's going to be a decision point. And at that decision point, we could like do a vote for it to continue on, or we could do a vote to close it. Or you could just say in 1 year, this DAO will close and that will shut down. Everyone will be returned their money and we'll know that that's coming. So if it's still going the way we want it to, we can just spin up a new DAO and people can re-up into that new DAO. So it actually is a way to like filter, like if someone's not paying attention or doesn't care anymore, they're going to get, knocked out of the first DAO that closes, and they probably won't come in the new DAO. And so you'll have like a filter mechanism for like removing some of the people that are not involved. And it's kind of a forced decision. So there's all these different things and tools and tricks like that you could start to think about for DAOs. Whether they'll work or not, we'd have to try some of them. But yeah, and a common kind of clear mission is important. But yeah,
it's interesting. I feel like on the mission point, I see a couple paths that DAOs can go. I feel like it's either extreme. Either have a clear mission so that people getting involved know what their money is going to be used for and what you're going to be working on. Or I think there's also a set of DAOs, and it's really like the community-oriented DAOs that don't necessarily really need to have a mission for how they're going to spend their money, but maybe at least for how they're going to spend their money. Maybe the mission is like be a community for all of the alumni from this school or whatever it is, then over time you might naturally raise money because things tend to get capitalized, especially in crypto. And then you get to decide how you want to spend that money. And maybe in that case, you don't need to know ahead of time how that money is going to be spent. I actually think nouns-ish DAOs tend to be a lot like that in some cases, where it's like, hey, if you're interested in this topic, come join the DAO. And then you pay a little bit to join, and now there's money in the treasury, and now you decide what you want to do with the money. So, I mean, can that work too? Or do you just feel like it's always a mistake not to know what you're going to do with your capital?
So we know it's still tricky because the original, the Nouns DAO, is like going through some of their own obstacles or issues right now, where there are some people that kind of want to like exit the DAO with their share of the treasury, and its original mission to like memify the world with nouns, and they also support public goods, and so their mission and their vision kind of has shifted or expanded over time. But for some people, it's maybe not that clear, and so even a big successful project like that, they have a giant treasury, but it's coming down to like, well, what does the collective as a whole want to do? And it's turning out to be quite tricky. And so it's not like, it's often not about like how much capital we have to accomplish things. It's about the collective being able to decide on what to do. So it can get blurry.
And I guess what leads to that problem, and I think DXDAO had this problem too, which is maybe a good problem to have, which is when the market value of the tokens is less than the book value or like the asset value of the treasury. So I think with Nouns DAOs, that's actually going to be pretty common, because over time, maybe there's less demand or the economy is not as strong. And so each new token might be selling for significantly less than if you multiplied that token's governance share times the amount of money in the treasury. And so in some ways, it's like, well, of course you'd want to join that DAO, because for less than $1,000, you can get a token that represents more than $1,000 worth of the treasury. But then, there's this issue of, well, should people be allowed to exit? And, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. So that seems like, and probably, I guess the same thing occurs in the corporate world, right? If there's a company whose assets are clearly worth more than its market cap, then probably someone takes the company private, right? Or buys all the shares and sells the assets. So it could be interesting to see.
And with DAOs, we have grants DAOs, we have investment DAOs, we have like builder DAOs, we have community DAOs. All these DAOs are different too, because when Nouns DAO launched, there was no like stated goal that there was going to be like a goal to provide a return to anyone, right? So if people weren't expecting a return, and now if there are people that hold nouns that are expecting a return, that becomes a big conflict in the community. So investment DAOs are like a whole nother like vertical, where there's kind of an expected return. But even rage quit, which is the right to exit that community, when you have investments that are not liquid, you can't really rage quit that easily. If the tokens are, all the assets are liquid, you can rage quit with your share. But if you have illiquid things, there is no like exit with your share, because your share only might come in the future.
Yeah, like most businesses don't have assets exceeding their market value, right? The value of that business is its intellectual property, the future income it will probably generate. And so I'd say probably most cases, you won't actually be in this situation where the book value is so much higher than the market value. Yeah. Sure. Cool. All right. So having been through everything you've been through in the world of DAOs, a couple questions for you before we close, and I'll give them to you both at once. Do you have any new favorite tools or tools you'd recommend that people check out if they're thinking about starting a DAO or they're involved in DAOs? And relatedly, any new favorite DAOs that people should check out, again, if they're either new to the world of DAOs or just looking for interesting DAOs to learn from?
Good question. In general, I would say, like, in terms of DAOs. So if you like DAOs and you like public goods, I would check out Public Nouns. So the site is publicnouns.wtf. It's a great way to get introduced to the Nouns DAO mechanism. And it's all about funding experiments in the public good space. And then in terms of tooling, I'm a big believer in like these on-chain tools. And so Moloch DAOs, you can check it out at DAOhaus, are really great ways to have true on-chain DAOs where your vote matters. And then obviously Safe is like the tried and tested like base tool. I'm actually at an event called DAO Palace here in northern Germany, and we did a whole thought experiment about like what is the, like, we're building very complex products and things, but like what is the hammer of DAOs, right? Like this hammer's been around for so long, it's very simple, but it's so perfect for what it actually does, right? With nails, it can put nails in, it can take nails out, and it can do a whole bunch of other things. And so we started talking about what are the things like the hammer of DAOs. And I'd say a very basic core DAO, to Brent Lee's tweet, like a very basic core DAO that can make these few decisions is a very basic primitive. And then multi-sigs like safes are also very core. People that experience what it is to manage capital as like a 2 of 3 or a 3 of 5, and that's the only way you can move that capital. The first time they do that, they're like, holy cow, like this is so different than a bank, right? We just made a decision together. 3 of the 5 of us made a decision and we moved capital. Like that's a really great feeling for people, and it shows you the power of these tools. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of all of those tools.
Yeah, so if people want to check that out, the leading provider of these multi-sigs is called Safe, or Gnosis Safe was the old name. Really easy to spin up although a little bit expensive if you do it on Ethereum, but easy to spin up a safe and make it a 3 of 5 or 4 of 7 or whatever you want. So definitely recommend.
And they're on all the other chains as well, and L2.
Good point.
So you can do it there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, awesome. Skye, this has been amazing. Where can people find you and or your projects on the web and on social?
Yeah, there's the public nouns one is publicnouns.wtf. Yeah, if you have any DXD, make sure you go and sell it against the order. And then my Twitter is SMINERT.
Awesome. Thank you. Where do people go to sell their order? CowSwap, you said?
CowSwap or 1inch. You can sell it. Okay. Either one of those.
Awesome. All right. So to the audience, you can find me on Twitter at 0xThriller, or my DAO is at MyDAODS. That's MIDAODS, or mydao.org. None of this has been or ever is legal advice or tax advice or financial advice. You should always find a lawyer to answer any questions and give you advice about particular legal matters. Again, Skye, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so much fun.
Adam, thanks for having me.
Yep. And for the audience, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it.